Now, we've talked thus far about this mainly of a problem internal to the self, right? Is your sense that intra-household issues are different and we need to think about them differently than inter-household issues? Is this really just who has a claim on the resources and what we can offer to sort of help people who want to maintain control?
Such an interesting question. So the boundaries are unclear between what's inter-household and what's inter-household. For example, how do we think about migrants and their families? Do we think that's inter-household or intra-household? They were part of that household and they left, but they're still considered part of that household. They just have a larger information asymmetry than they did before. Right? What about my relatives? Sometimes they're part of my household. Sometimes they're not. And so the boundaries of households, especially in developing countries, are quite porous. And so all in part a way of answering the question to say, it's not so much how I define potentially your relationship to me, whether you're my spouse, whether you're my child, whether you're a relative, whether you're a coworker, but rather what is the information asymmetry at work? I would say that that's the primary factor that's most important. I mean, you could say, what is my social responsibility to you? That gets more complicated. I would say we can start with a very simple one, which is, as an economist would think, which is where are the sources of information asymmetry? The interesting thing about looking at husbands and wives first is that those are places where we wouldn't consider information asymmetries to be terribly at work. Although what we see in the field is constantly spouses hiding money from each other in a sustained way. So you would think that this would be hard to do over time, somebody could figure it out. And it is hard if you know how much money that spouse should be making. But in so many people's work, the money is very, it comes in many different forms, it comes at different times, so it's hard to keep track. And so you can see a sustained way of strategically hiding behavior. Now, the farther away these spouses get from each other, which some people do strategically. So there's stories of women selling. Actually, this is actually a story of husbands selling tea that Marcel Faustins told me in faraway markets, so that the spouse wouldn't know what the price of that tea was to be able to know how much they should have brought back. Right? And then, of course, with migration or with other things, you have much greater information asymmetries. That's where the information asymmetry can also manifest itself not only in geographic distance, but also in the technology. So if you have a bank account, for example, that requires co-signing, that creates information asymmetry. You don't even have to co-signing. You could just have, the way we did in the remittance product that we designed for Salvadorian migrants, you could just allow them to see the balances or allow them to see the transactions. Right? So these are different features of the product that make it more or less concealable. And that's an important feature of technology. I've looked at that also in the space of birth control, for example, in family planning, where you have technologies that are more or less concealable from the spouse. So when you have differences in preferences around saving and spending, that technology can itself create an information asymmetry that one spouse can strategically use to be able to implement their preferences over another spouse's preferences.
So in one way that has historically been managed in households is that husbands are responsible for certain things in the household, buying and those sorts of things, and wives are responsible for others. So Esther Duflo and others have some work somewhere in West Africa, I can't remember, about there are different goods that each is responsible for in different crops, and if one fails, there isn't that sort of perfect transfer depending on those sorts of things. Is this really just an evolution of traditional mechanisms for managing those intra-household conflicts, and we should just think of it in the context of there are roles and needs, and we're sort of helping to reinforce those things, or should we be breaking down how should we be thinking about this in terms of what's happening inside the household?
So the very first thing that most people are not doing, but we need to first start doing before we can even answer your question, is to recognize that there are roles in the household and that these vary tremendously between societies, but not in a way that everything is unique and therefore we can't do anything. I mean, we can actually look at patterns. So and then we can say, okay, answer all those questions. But the first is just to realize that those roles and that structure is going to interact with your product, your technology, to create the savings impact that you will see in the account balances, right? And so what do I mean by that in terms of the roles? You gave an example of certain societies where husbands are responsible for example, the buying. There's some of that in Côte d'Ivoire where Esther Duflo and Chris Udry did their study, but there they also have some separate accounts that they can use separately. In the Philippines, for example, where we did our commitment savings, it's a completely different model. So the model there, even in the marriage ceremony, the husband hands over coins to the wife to symbolize the roles that they're supposed to take in the household, which is the husband makes money. Of course, the wife makes money too, but the husband is supposed to turn over all the money to the wife, and the wife is the manager of the household. She's the manager of the budget. That doesn't necessarily mean she has power.
Right.
It just means that she manages the budget, which can be a headache, as anyone who's managed budgets well knows.
Especially those without power.
Exactly, exactly, and with very limited budgets. And that actually is similar in many, many countries of the world. So in Japan, it's similar in lots of countries in Asia. There are places in Latin America where this is actually the case. And so this differentiation, it can become actually very, very critical, because if a woman is in charge of that, she does have some degree of control to allocate, just again from the information asymmetry angle. She has some degree of power to allocate there. And therefore, there might be an incentive on the husband's side not to turn over everything to her, particularly if he knows that she would prefer to save more of it than he would. And what that means, both on a household level, as a country, and sort of in general in terms of, economic development, is that there may be many inefficient strategies to saving and spending money. Energy and time and attention and money is going into creating these strategic hiding opportunities rather than thinking about what is the most efficient use of the resources. So what's important to recognize when you're walking into, when you're launching a product into a new country, is what are the existing roles in terms of who is responsible for saving and spending money. And that has implications for, whether you're going to have co-signing either product, how much property rights and degree of observability are you going to put on the products themselves. For example, there's a study in England where, so think about deposit side incentives. There's a study in England where they had the paychecks going directly from the husbands who were getting them to the wives. And then there was a change in savings. So now if you have the deposit side incentives and automatic transfers, right, maybe there's going to be a desire not to do that, because if that account is now observable to both sides, I'm not going to want to have all my money be put into that account.
I mean, it has some real implications about the design of electronic payments products, particularly.
Yes, definitely.
It doesn't probably get enough attention that there are lots of reasons people inside the household might not want a transaction record, and not just nefarious purposes.
Completely.
That, we built up these structures to manage intra-household conflict in productive ways, and not in potentially violent ways. That it involves hiding things so that everybody can you keep the peace. There's a value of secrets in their ability to keep the peace.
Right.
If we suddenly make everything transparent, you
That's
can see
also
some
true. I mean,
problems
it's interesting because the autonomy of having your own account. I mean, there's one model of efficient household decision making which says we should be absolutely having all the information on the table. And with complete information and communication, we're able to make efficient decisions. I mean, we think about that also in any kind of principal agent model.
Right.
You have information asymmetries will often, but not always, lead to inefficiency. What you're suggesting is that actually, given that information asymmetry itself could create a lot of actually problematic strategic behavior, perhaps the second best solution would be to have one's own accounts, not share everything, but not even not share everything, not even share all information. And I think depending on the production structure of the household, that can be inefficient. Now, if both people are producing separately, then you would think that actually that makes a lot of sense, right, in terms of efficiency. If, on the other hand, the household is a farming household and has to pool its resources to make efficient farming input decisions, and that's the production, it may be different.
Right. So you can see a.
I think that, sorry, the takeaway is absolutely that any of these products are going to have implications in terms of intra-household conflict, in terms of strategic incentives, based on the existing structures that are there.
I mean, you can see that there's a potential value in the separation of things just because there's just so many things to pay attention to.
Yes.
And as you make more things transparent, there's an additional attentional cost of how many more things I need to pay attention to now that it's transparent. And theoretically, we think, yes, the more information, the better decisions, but realistically, we know that sometimes that's just not the case.
Also true, yeah.
More information yields worse decisions because you just can't keep track of all the important information. Sendel has this new learning by noticing paper about it's really hard to figure out what stuff you're supposed to pay attention to.
Yep, absolutely. And part of the reason we have roles in society in general is specialization and the benefits to that, right? So there's a huge benefit to having people specialized in the household in doing different tasks, even if that creates greater information asymmetries.
So circling back to this question, what's your take on the relative importance of me controlling myself, making commitments between my present and my future self, versus the inter and intra-household information asymmetries things? It's possible that one product can solve both, but we should really be taking the balance of those into account when we design the products in the first place.
Yeah.
What's the relative importance there?
I think it depends on the settings we're going into. In settings where we have established separate accounts and people have learned to manage their own savings, then it really does become, the primary thing does become interpersonal. I mean, interestingly, as you know, our commitment savings product was only taken up by time inconsistent women, not time inconsistent men. So that the women were the ones that were driving the take-up of the commitment, the ones who were time inconsistent. Now, what that says is we all have present biases, not like women have less than men, but in a society in which women are supposed to be the keepers of the money and able to hold themselves to the commitment of the family, women are the commitment devices of their husbands in this setting. The women then require something to help them, the ones who actually generally have this problem more than, So I also believe that there's a distribution of this in the population. Not everyone has intrapersonal, conflict, but for those who do and who are then charged with meeting the household savings goals, they absolutely need a commitment device. And what that suggests is that in a society where each of us are responsible for our own savings goals, and we can rely on each other less to do that, then the intrapersonal questions become really critical in terms of designing the products. But in many, many developing countries, there are tremendous intra-household and inter-household factors that are at play in the savings and spending decisions. And they are not made independently. In those situations, it's critical to be able to think about the intra-household and inter-household questions. I think the other key thing we need to think about is this isn't a problem if there isn't different preferences in the household. So, this is only the case where one person wants to save more than the other one does. Or one person wants the money to be spent in a different way, for example. And where your family might be asking you for money and you need to save it and you don't have the same preferences. And we believe that people should be able to work this out, and I think products can help people work that out. But if there aren't different preferences to begin with, then you don't have a problem. Similarly to how internally, if there isn't a difference between my preferences right now and my preferences in the future, no problem.